Well, bushmeat or wild meat is basically any flesh of animals that people are consuming anywhere in the world. So if you think of in Europe, people hunting wild boar or even hunting rabbits and hares, that's a form of bushmeat, a form of wild meat. But the term bushmeat has been used in relation to Africa, very much linked to the animals that are being eaten from the bush, from the forest, or from savannas, and are being consumed by people on a regular basis. If you think also about the number of people that depend on wild meat worldwide, we may have millions of people all over the world that are reliant on the protein and on the fat and on the micronutrients that come out of the flesh of wild animals. So it's not just something linked to Africa. It's very much a consumption of wild animals all over the world, but in particular in tropical and subtropical areas, because there are more people that are dependent on wild meat or bushmeat than in other parts of the world. What happens in places like tropical rainforest is that the possibility of you rearing game, rearing animals for your own consumption, you know, cows and other animals like that, is less. So therefore you are more dependent on the animals that come from the wild. It is very important precisely because of this issue of food security. That is what we call the dependence of people on the animals and other things that come out of the forest. But also it's a form of livelihood. Some people can actually sell the meat that they hunt and get money that they can use for their well-being. So it is an incredibly important problem. There are issues with the overconsumption of wild animals, or the overhunting of wild animals. We know that a very large number of species, particularly mammals, are subjected to overexploitation and are threatened with extinction because you are taking more animals from the populations that the population can reproduce. So one of the issues with bushmeat or wild meat is the fact that you are taking more animals out of the wild than they can reproduce. So therefore it has a problem. It is a problem in terms of the conservation of some species, particularly the large species, because large species take longer to reproduce. That's the main issue, isn't it? I mean, it's all right when you have rural communities depending on the animals they take out of the forest. If the numbers of people in the area, number of hunters, in fact, is low, then obviously the impact on animals is going to be low. But one of the major issues that we have nowadays is that there is a huge flow of animal meat from the rural areas, from the forest, to supply urban consumers. If you have large cities in Africa, like Kinshasa, that has over 10 million people, if those 10 million people are demanding wild meat, obviously there's going to be a major impact on these populations of animals that are supplying the markets in urban centers. But these markets and all the people living in cities don't really need that meat, that protein, because there are other alternatives. In terms of scale, we are dealing with millions of tons of meat that's coming out of the forest to supply big cities in Africa, in Asia, and even in the Amazon in Latin America. We know there is movement of bushmeat, wild meat, into Europe. And we know that animals from the wild as bushmeat are entering countries like Britain or countries like Spain, Belgium, France, and possibly even Italy. We have to find a solution. And the solution is not just banning the consumption or hunting of wild meat. That is not the solution in many parts of the world where people are still dependent on wild meat, of course. So we need to curtail or, completely stop the flow of wild animals coming into urban centers within the tropical countries themselves. And this is because, as I said earlier, people do have alternatives if you live in cities, and also because, you are taking away food from the rural areas. That's the first thing that we should be concentrating on. The other thing is to make sure that people living in the forest, in these rural areas, that they have access to the resources that they need in order to survive. So there's got to be regulations, there's got to be, attention paid to allowing indigenous peoples and rural people to have access to the resources that they have had access to for millennia in some cases. Because it's an interconnected world, and we no longer live separate from other parts of the world. I think we should care for two reasons, because if we defaunate, the word is, we're taking animals out of forest, it's going to have an impact on those forest ecosystems. So these ecosystems, the functions of these ecosystems depends on the animals themselves. So if we allow these animals to be taken out of the forest, it's not just a conservation issue, it's also a function issue. These forests will become empty, and if they become empty, then they're not going to they're not going to perform their particular function. And that has an impact on the longevity of these natural systems. As a world, as citizens of the world, we need to make sure that these ecosystems keep alive, stay alive into the future. And the other issue with bushmeat, as we've said before, is a whole question of spillover of disease. If we don't care about deforestation, we don't care about the use of wild meat, we could have another COVID-19. We could have another pandemic that, as we've seen, has virtually destroyed many economies and have caused the deaths of many, many, many people. So these are two very solid reasons why Italians, and in fact citizens anywhere in the world, should care about what's happening in these places.